In the world of high-stakes criminal finance, the most dangerous person in the room is never the one with the gun. It's the one who knows where every dollar came from and where every dollar went. Rosalind Beckett had known that for 7 years. 7 years of sitting behind a frosted glass partition on the 42nd floor of Vance Meridian Capital, a firm that on paper managed private equity portfolios for ultra-high net worth clients across the Southeast. On paper. In reality, Rosalind knew exactly what Vance Meridian was. She'd figured it out in her 3rd week, when the wire transfer logs didn't match the client's statements by a margin too clean to be accidental. Someone was washing money, a lot of it, methodically, elegantly, with the kind of precision that only came from either a brilliant criminal mind or a very expensive accountant. It turned out to be both. She should have quit. She'd told herself that approximately 400 times over 7 years. But the salary was 3 times what she could get anywhere else with her credentials. The benefits were exceptional. And, if she was being brutally honest with herself, the work was the most intellectually stimulating thing she had ever encountered. Rosalind Beckett was, above all else, a woman who needed her mind engaged. And nothing engaged it quite like an 18-layer shell corporation structure, funneling casino revenue through 4 different jurisdictions into a series of legitimate real estate holdings along the Florida coast. She was 31 years old. She wore glasses with thick tortoiseshell frames that kept sliding down her nose. She kept 3 mechanical pencils in her cardigan pocket at all times, and had a habit of tapping them against her knee when she was thinking hard. She was, by every conventional metric, completely unremarkable, the kind of woman people looked through rather than at, which was precisely why she'd survived 7 years in a building full of dangerous men without anyone looking at her too closely. She was the ghost in the machine, the invisible accountant who made everything balance. She was also, without her knowledge or consent, about to become the most important person in the room. The man who ran Vance Meridian's real operations was not the name on the letterhead. The name on the letterhead was a 73-year-old retired banker in Coral Gables who played golf on Tuesdays and genuinely believed he was the chairman of a legitimate investment firm. He was not. He was a figurehead, carefully selected for his impeccable reputation and his charming inability to read a balance sheet. The man who actually ran things was Matteo Lorca, 44 years old. Born in Miami to a Cuban mother and a Sicilian father, which meant he'd inherited the stubbornness of both cultures in full measure and the charm of neither, as far as Rosalind could tell. He had the kind of face that photographers would call interesting. Not conventionally handsome, but intensely present, with dark eyes that moved like a hawk's and a jaw that suggested he had never once backed down from anything in his life. He wore bespoke suits that cost more than Rosalind's monthly rent and kept his hair cut close enough that it never gave anyone anything to grab. Rosalind had worked 3 floors below him for 7 years. He had spoken to her exactly 4 times. Once, in the elevator, when he'd asked her to hold the door. Once, at the company holiday party, when he'd looked directly at her name badge and said, "Beckett," with a slight nod, the way you acknowledge a piece of office furniture that has been adequately placed. Once, when there was a fire drill and he'd emerged from the stairwell into her section of the floor, looking faintly annoyed, and asked where the nearest exit was, as though the fire drill signs covering every wall were insufficient. And once, the one she remembered most, when she'd been working late on a reconciliation report, and he'd appeared in the doorway of the records room at 11:30 at night, looked at her for a long moment and said, "You're still here." Not a question, just an observation. "The Cayman accounts won't reconcile themselves," she'd said, without looking up from her screen. There had been a silence, then the sound of him walking away. That was the sum total of their relationship for 7 years. It was, she told herself, entirely sufficient. The night everything changed, Rosalind was doing what she did most nights, staying late. It was a Thursday in late October, and the rest of the floor had cleared out by 7. She had her cardigan, her mechanical pencils, a cold cup of coffee she'd forgotten to drink 3 hours ago, and a spreadsheet that was giving her a very specific kind of headache, the kind that meant someone, somewhere, had made an error that was not actually an error. A deliberate discrepancy, small enough to overlook. But Rosalind Beckett did not overlook things. She was tracing the thread of it. A $340,000 variance in the Bissing Holdings account, routed through a subsidiary she'd never seen referenced before, when she heard the voices. Not from the floor, from the stairwell. Low, urgent, in 2 languages she recognized, English and what she was fairly certain was Haitian Creole. The second voice was angry. The first, she placed it after a moment, and her stomach dropped, was Matteo Lorca, and he was not using his boardroom tone. She didn't move. Then the stairwell door banged open, and 3 men came through it at a speed that was not consistent with normal movement patterns, followed by Matteo himself, and then, with a sound she felt in her chest before she processed it intellectually, gunfire from somewhere below, muffled by the fire door swinging shut. Rosalind sat very still. Matteo's eyes swept the floor and found her in approximately 1.2 seconds. His expression did something she'd never seen it do before. It tightened very briefly into something that looked almost like alarm. "Beckett," he was already moving toward her. "Get up, now." Now." She got up. She grabbed her bag by reflex, which in retrospect was both practical and slightly absurd given the circumstances. Matteo crossed the floor in 8 strides, took her by the arm, not roughly, but with a certainty that admitted no argument, and steered her toward the northeast corner of the building, through the executive corridor, to a door she had walked past 700 times and never thought much about. He pressed his palm to a biometric panel she hadn't known was there, and the door opened. Inside was a room she had no framework for. It was maybe 400 square feet, with reinforced walls she could tell were thick from the way the sound changed the moment the door sealed behind them. There were monitors on one wall, dark. A small table, 2 chairs, a cot folded against the far wall, a locked cabinet, emergency lighting in deep amber. The temperature was controlled. The door sealed with a sound like a vault. She stood very still. "Safe room," Matteo said, already at the monitors, bringing them to life with practiced efficiency. "I gathered," Rosalind said. He glanced at her sideways, that almost alarm again, and then something that might have been the ghost of something else. "Most people would be more upset right now. I'm processing," she said. "Give me a moment." She sat down in one of the chairs and breathed carefully through her nose. Outside, somewhere in the building, men were doing things that she was making a deliberate choice not to think about in specific terms. Inside, the amber light made everything feel slightly underwater. Matteo Lorca stood at the monitors with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and Rosalind noticed for the first time that his forearms were covered in faded ink she'd never seen because he was always fully suited. "Who are they?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Not evasively. It felt more like he was deciding how much she already knew. "The Devereaux Network," he said finally. "They've been trying to move on the port contracts for 8 months. Tonight, they decided to stop asking." Rosalind was quiet for a moment. The Biscayne Holdings discrepancy. He turned from the monitors. Slowly. "The $340,000 variance I was tracking tonight," she said. "It routes through a subsidiary called Halcyon Bridge LLC, which I'd never seen before. But if I'm reading it correctly, and I am, it's a pass-through account. Someone inside was feeding financial information to an outside party. Position reports, client routing, probably for the last 4 months." She paused. "I was going to flag it in the morning." Matteo stared at her. Not the way he'd looked at her in the elevator. Not the way you look at furniture. Something else entirely. "How long have you known what this company actually is?" he said. The honest answer was, 7 years. The strategic answer was, "This is not a conversation to have in a sealed room with a man whose organization is currently being shot at." "Long enough to understand how the accounts work," she said carefully. Another silence. He turned back to the monitors. They were in that room for 9 hours. Rosalind had expected the silence to be unbearable. It wasn't. Matteo was not a man who filled quiet with noise for the sake of filling it, which she found unexpectedly tolerable. Around midnight, he found a protein bar in the emergency cabinet and handed it to her without comment. She ate half of it and handed the other half back. He ate it without ceremony. Around 2 in the morning, she fell asleep in the chair. She didn't mean to. She woke up to find a folded jacket over her shoulders. His jacket, she registered, which meant he was down to his dress shirt, and the room still amber-lit and quiet. She sat up and found him watching the monitors, one arm resting on the table, completely still. "Anything," she said. "Building's been cleared," he said. "My people have the lower floors. We wait until I get confirmation on the exits." She nodded. She straightened her glasses. Her mechanical pencil had fallen out of her cardigan pocket at some point and rolled under the table, and she retrieved it by reflex, and when she sat up, she found Matteo watching her with an expression she had genuinely never seen on his face before. Not the hawkish assessment, not the controlled professional distance, something unguarded. Like she had, in the process of doing something entirely mundane, briefly become visible in a way she hadn't been before. "You've been in this building for 7 years, he said. "Yes, you know everything." It was not a question. "I know the accounts," she said. "I know the structures. I know how the money moves and where it goes and what the patterns mean." She held his gaze. "I also know that information is worth considerably more as a protected asset than as a liability." He was very quiet. "What I mean," she said, "is that I have no interest in being a problem for you. I came to work. I did my job. I found a discrepancy that was about to cause you significant trouble, and I was going to tell you about it in the morning." She paused. "I'm not a threat, Mr. Lorca, Matteo," he said. She blinked. 7 years, he said. "You can call me Matteo." She wasn't sure why that particular moment, in a sealed room in the middle of a crisis, in the amber dark, with a jacket that smelled like cedar over her shoulders, cracked something open in her chest, but it did. "Rosalind," she said. He repeated it quietly, testing the shape of it, like he was committing it somewhere important. The confirmation came at 4:17 in the morning. The exits were clear. Matteo's team had the building. The Devereaux men were gone in the particular way that meant they would not be coming back. When the vault door opened, Rosalind walked out into the wreckage of the executive floor. Overturned chairs, shattered glass, the lingering chemical smell of smoke, and felt with absolute clarity that her life had just divided itself into a before and an after. He sent a car for her the next morning, not to the office. To her apartment in Coral Gables, a third-floor walk-up she'd lived in for 5 years, with plants on the balcony and a whiteboard in the kitchen. She used to think through complex reconciliations. The driver was polite and communicative only in the sense that he told her, when she asked where they were going, "Mr. Lorca's residence." She thought about objecting. She didn't, for reasons she wasn't entirely prepared to examine. The Lorca residence was on a private road in Coconut Grove, behind a gate that looked like landscaping and was not. The house was a 1930s Spanish colonial that had been meticulously maintained. Terracotta, white stucco, the smell of jasmine from gardens that wrapped the property in something that felt almost intentionally peaceful, given what the man who lived here did for a living. Matteo met her in the entrance hall. He had slept. She could tell from the slight adjustment in his bearing, the controlled looseness of someone who had taken a few hours. He was in dark trousers and a simple shirt, no tie, which was the most informal she had ever seen him. "You didn't have to come," he said. "Your driver didn't give me enormous latitude to decline," she said. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, the structural suggestion of one. He brought her into a study that smelled like old books and excellent coffee, and told her, without preamble, that the situation with the Devereaux network was ongoing, that the internal leak she'd identified had been traced to a mid-level portfolio manager who was no longer employed in any capacity, and that her position, meaning her life, meaning her safety, was now a logistical concern that he intended to manage personally. "I have an apartment," she said. You have an apartment that 3 people now know the address of who shouldn't, he said. She was quiet. There are guest rooms here, he said. You would have full use of the property. Your work would continue. I need the Halcyon Bridge thread followed to its endpoint. You're the only person in my organization with the full structural picture. He paused, and she noticed he chose his next words with unusual care. I'm not asking you to stay as an employee. I'm asking as a request, between equals. Rosalind looked at him for a long moment. I'll need my whiteboard, she said. I'll have it moved today. She had been there for 3 weeks when she found out she was pregnant. She knew before the test confirmed it, the way bodies sometimes announce things before the mind is ready to receive them. A particular exhaustion, a sensitivity to the coffee she'd been drinking for 12 years. The way the jasmine in the garden, which she'd found pleasant when she arrived, had become suddenly overwhelming. She sat on the edge of the guest bathroom counter for a long time after the test. Outside the window, she could hear the distant sound of the Biscayne Bay, and closer, the particular footsteps of Matteo making his way along the east corridor toward the study, a sound she'd learned to recognize. She realized, the way you learn the rhythms of a house you've begun to think of as yours. She was not panicking. She was characteristically processing. The night in the safe room, the amber dark, the jacket over her shoulders and the protein bar split in half, and the moment he'd said her name like he was learning a new language. The 3 weeks since, meals at the same table, late nights over the same files, a conversation about the nature of loyalty that had lasted until 2 in the morning and ended with his hand resting near hers on the table in a way that neither of them had mentioned afterward. She was 31 years old. She had built her entire life around being unseen, and now she was sitting in the bathroom of a kingpin's house in Coconut Grove, holding a positive pregnancy test, trying to calculate the odds on a situation that had no historical precedent in her experience. She put the test in her cardigan pocket, straightened her glasses, went back to work. She lasted 4 days before the decision about when to tell him was made for her. He found the test. Not in the way she'd feared, not snooping, not invasion. She had transferred it from her pocket to her desk at some point, during a particularly intense reconciliation session. The way she moved things around unconsciously when she was thinking hard, and she'd forgotten it was there when she'd left the room to take a call. She came back to find him standing at her desk, still looking at it. The silence lasted approximately 5 seconds, which felt significantly longer. Rosalind, he said. His voice was different, not louder, not harder, something stripped down to the center of it. I was going to tell you, she said. I was figuring out the right. She stopped, tried again. I found out 4 days ago. I was trying to find the words. He turned to look at her, the hawk's eyes, but different now. Something in them she'd never seen, something that made her chest feel like it was reorganizing itself. Is it? He started. Yes, she said. The safe room, obviously. He crossed the room, not fast, deliberately, each step like a decision. He stopped in front of her, and she had to tilt her head up slightly to meet his eyes, and she was entirely unprepared for what she found there. Not calculation, not the man who managed logistics and outcomes with the precision of a machine. Something much older than that. You weren't going to tell me, he said quietly. I needed to know what I was telling you, what it meant, what you would. She stopped. I've spent 7 years being invisible. You looked through me every day for 7 years. I didn't know how to factor in what you would. I never looked through you, he said. She went very still. I looked at you constantly, he said. I made a deliberate choice, every day not to look too long, because you were the one person in my building who actually saw everything clearly, and I couldn't afford to give you a reason to become a liability. He paused, and something about the way he said the next part made it land like a stone in still water. I noticed when you changed your glasses frames. I noticed when you stayed until midnight, 3 Thursdays in a row. I noticed when you wore that particular grey cardigan, because it meant you were working a problem that was bothering you. I noticed you, Rosalind. I just couldn't let myself. The jasmine smell came through the window. Somewhere on the bay, a boat motor. She sat down in her chair because she genuinely wasn't sure her legs were interested in continuing. "That's a lot to say to someone who just showed you a positive pregnancy test," she said. "I know," he said. "I should have said most of it before now." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He pulled the other chair close and sat in it, which put them at the same level. Close enough that she could see the faded ink on his forearms where his sleeve had pushed up. "I want this," he said. Clearly, directly, "I want this. The child. You here. This." He gestured slightly between them, a man not accustomed to gesturing at abstract things. "I know that asking you to want the same thing, given everything, is not a simple request. I know who I am and what I run and what that means. I'm not asking you to make a decision right now." She looked at him. "I'm asking you," he said, "to let me try. To have the chance to show you something different than what you've seen so far." "I've seen plenty," she said. "You've seen my work," he said. "You haven't seen me." She thought about that for a long moment, tapping her mechanical pencil against her knee. "I'll need ground rules," she said finally. "Name them. I keep full access to the accounts. I'm not decorative. I'm not a kept woman in a house. If I'm here, I'm working, and my judgment on the financial structures is final." "Agreed. If I ever decide this isn't working, any of it, you don't make that difficult." He held her gaze. "Agreed. And you stop calling me Beckett in front of the staff. It's been 7 years. You know my name." Something moved through his expression, that structural suggestion of a smile again, but this time it went the full distance. It changed his face in a way she hadn't anticipated and made her chest do something inconvenient. "Rosalind," he said, "just that. Like the first time, but different. Like a door opening from the inside." The weeks that followed were, in the way of things that matter, both ordinary and entirely new. She worked from the study most mornings. The halcyon bridge thread finally fully unraveled. 17 shell entities, 3 jurisdictions, and a customs official in Savannah who would shortly be having a very difficult conversation with some very serious men. Matteo was in and out, moving through the specific gravity of his world. But the house had a rhythm to it now that included her in a way she hadn't expected. He brought coffee without being asked. He remembered she couldn't stand the smell of the jasmine candles anymore, and had them removed from the east wing without mentioning it. He sat across from her in the evenings sometimes and read while she worked. And there was something in that particular quiet. 2 people in the same room, each doing their own thing, not needing to fill the space. That felt more intimate than a great deal of things she'd experienced. She had been invisible for so long. It was a strange, disorienting thing to be seen. There was nothing simple about what she had stepped into. She understood that with the precision she brought to everything, the organization, the risk, the particular weight of being present in a life that operated outside ordinary structures, she was not naive about any of it. But she had also, after 7 years of sitting behind a frosted glass partition and watching everything and saying nothing, a deep and thorough understanding of how this world worked, and a pragmatic sense of her own position within it. She was not powerless here. She had never been powerless here. She had simply been unclaimed. The day that changed was not a dramatic one. No crisis, no adrenaline, no amber emergency lighting. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Matteo had 3 of his senior men in the formal sitting room for a meeting that she'd walked past twice without acknowledgement, the way she'd been doing for years, the invisible woman passing through. She was on her way back from the kitchen with a glass of water when she heard one of the men. She'd seen him before, never spoken to him, a broad-shouldered man named Reyes that Matteo's security team called Burke. Say something that involved her name in a tone that was, if not directly threatening, the specific kind of dismissive that always preceded something worse. She kept walking. Matteo met her in the hallway 20 seconds later. "I need you in the room," he said. "I don't think Mr. Burke is enthusiastic about that." "Mr. Burke's enthusiasm is not a variable that affects my decisions," Matteo said, and held the door open. She walked in. The three men in the room adjusted to her presence the way men in rooms like this always did when she entered them. A slight recalibration, a reassessment, a shuffling of assumptions. She was used to it. She set her water glass down on the side table and waited. Matteo didn't sit. He stood at the head of the room and looked at his three men with the expression she'd seen him use when something needed to be made permanently clear. "Rosalind manages the full financial architecture of this organization," he said. "Every decision about the accounts, the structure, the routing, that goes through her. What she tells you is what I'm telling you. Her word in this house and in this business is my word." He paused. "I also want to be direct about one other thing, since I understand there have been questions." He looked at Burke specifically. "She carries my child. She will be the mother of my heir. And she is, by her own intelligence, her own work, and my complete conviction, the only partner in this organization who has full sight of everything we are. I'd encourage everyone in this room to calibrate accordingly." Nobody spoke. Rosalind picked up her water glass. "The Halcyon Bridge report is ready," she said. "I'll have it distributed this afternoon. There are 3 action items on the Savannah situation that need to be resolved before the end of the week." She looked at the man next to Burke. "That's you, I believe. Mr. Lorca will brief you on the specifics." The meeting concluded 12 minutes later. In the hallway afterward, Matteo fell into step beside her, and she was quiet for a long moment, moving through the house she'd learned to navigate as her own, past the study with the whiteboard covered in her handwriting, and the kitchen where the coffee was already made every morning when she came down, and the garden where the jasmine had been pulled back from the east-facing windows. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes," he said. "I did." She considered that. "Calibrate accordingly," she said. That was a little theatrical. "It landed," he said. She couldn't argue with that. She stopped at the door to the study and looked at him, really looked at him the way she'd spent 7 years carefully not doing. The dark eyes, the particular quality of his attention, the man who had noticed her grey cardigan and her late nights, and the pattern of her thinking, all while pretending as carefully as she had that there was nothing there to see. 2 people who were very good at being invisible to everyone except, apparently, each other. "For the record," she said, "I want this too." Clearly, she held his gaze. "I just needed you to understand that I'm not here because I have nowhere else to go. I'm here because I choose to be. That distinction matters to me." He looked at her with the expression that always went just past the smile, to something quieter and more permanent. "I know," he said. "That's why it matters to me too." She nodded once, straightened her glasses, and went back to work.